Thank you for the opportunity of serving you as honorary chair of this conference. I only wish I could join you in one of the most beautiful cities in the world, a city which has so many have fought to claim as theirs, the English, the French, and several of the First Nations, and the unfortunate and unsuccessful attempts of my own country. To the winners of the War of 1812, as Louisiana celebrates the bicentennial of the Battle of New Orleans, I salute the people of Montreal, Quebec, Canada, and our shared victories. I'm in the closing days of a political campaign to carry the Enlightenment values to Washington. I served as governor of Louisiana for a record 4 terms. That doesn't qualify me as an Enlightenment scholar, but I have learned from experience, both from governing and as a recipient of the unwanted and unwarranted attention of a central government which chose to ignore both those values and principles. Governance is the art of fairly distributing the rights and obligations which we, in our social agreement, have chosen to recognize. Our judicial system operates along the same lines as those in Canada. We respect the rule of law. We often get it right, but there are some exceptions. Contributors to the Enlightenment, whether they were followers of Islam, which kept the light of learning lit while Europe was extinguished during the Dark Ages, or the Chinese who influenced the Jesuits and thus the French, or the English, the Scots, the Spanish, the Germans, Italians, and Swiss, each offering a voice of distributive justice. I have dedicated my career to its goals, whether for unfettered free discussion of ideas, freedom from arbitrary centralized government surveillance and misuse of the judicial process, for access to health care, education, and employment, or the right, as a former Supreme Court justice said, just to be left alone. Your conference of shared scholarship, studies, and robust disagreement forms the basis from which we members of society choose the best offerings to show the way forward. The scholar's task is rigorous research and the accompanying scrutiny and testing of ideas. Government's task is to implement those choices. Yes, we hear continued calls for the STEM curriculum, science, technology, engineering, and math. They are important, but without the humanities to teach us how history has succeeded or failed in directing the fruits of technology and science to the betterment of our tribe of Homo sapiens, without the humanities to teach us how to frame the discussion without properly debating the uses and costs of technology, without the humanities to teach us how to safely debate how to create a more just society with our fellow humans, technology and science would eventually default to the ownership of and misuse by the most influential, the most powerful, and the most feared among us. I recognize my debt, and I'm indeed proud to champion the contributions of my French ancestors, in particular the 300-year history of French intellectual thought in Louisiana. On May 7th of 1718, when Bienville founded the city of New Orleans, Voltaire had been released from the Bastille only 3 weeks earlier, his first of several imprisonments, exiles, banishments, and book burnings. 50 years later, in 1768, 5 years before the Boston Tea Party, French intellectuals in New Orleans wrote their manifesto against arbitrary Spanish rule, followed by brutal repression. The next generation penned its own Enlightenment-inspired memorial to Congress in 1804, taking aim at arbitrary military occupation and despotic government set in motion, ironically by another Enlightenment scholar, Thomas Jefferson. Yes, the French got it right in demanding the right to self-government, the right of representation, and the rights guaranteed by the Treaty of Cession between Jefferson and Napoleon. But it must be said, my French ancestors, even with the benefit of enlightenment, got it terribly wrong in insisting in that same memorial on the continued and expanded enslavement of persons, largely from Africa and the Caribbean, as well as Native Americans, to provide the energy which created untold wealth in which those enslaved persons would not share. A lesson to be learned from that bittersweet success and failure is that we must be vigilant, that we not let others and not let ourselves hold out the lamp of entitlement to justify unjustifiable choices and conduct. We must not use it to shine on our pride while we allow ourselves to be blinded by our prejudice. As the 18th century drew to its close in French Louisiana, Jefferson, along with a host of powerful Washington and East Coast elite, had tried to extinguish French culture, language, religion, and law, and customs. As the 18th century drew to its close in French Louisiana, Jefferson, along with a host of powerful East Coast elite, had tried to extinguish French culture, language, religion, law, and customs in their new possession. Enlightenment ideas skillfully yielded by the French inhabitants and not military force carried the day. Louisiana achieved statehood in record time, keeping its French language, customs, laws, and religion intact. Writing later, de Tocqueville warned against the tyranny of the majority, a concern which resonates today. A government which loses sight of the social compact which gives its validity is capable of doing and has done great harm by abusing the power entrusted to it. This I know from personal experience, and so did David Hume, denied a university position for holding unpopular views. So did John Locke and Thomas Hobbes, each having to flee England to avoid arrest. Rousseau fled France to avoid arrest. One of the legacies of which I am most proud is Louisiana's 1974 Constitution and its provision that the right of the people to preserve, foster, and promote their respective historic, linguistic, and cultural origins is recognized. With that in place, the tide had turned. The English only of prior constitutions, practices, and prejudices, particularly against Acadians, had ended, yielding a shared cultural renaissance and economic bounty, including the arts, music, dance, literature, cuisine, and historical preservation and conservation for years ahead. I wish this conference every success. I wish I could join you in person. But let these days serve to remind us of the need to remain vigilant and not to take our freedoms or the enlightenment for granted. There's work to do. Thank you.